Oggetti socievoli.
Oggetti Socievoli presenta.
A Conversation With is hosted by Prisca Arosio.
My name's Dr. Kim Barber. I'm a tenured senior lecturer at the University of Adelaide in Australia, where I work in the Department of Media. And there I teach in the undergraduate Bachelor of Media program, and I also supervise postgraduate research. So as a researcher, I tend to call myself a qualitative new media scholar in the field of persona studies. And what that means is that I focus on identity performance, particularly on and through social media. I've written on online personas created by artists, by professionals, by migrants, by academic, and by everyday people. And I've also worked with images created of home spaces in particular, and looking at how those images are shared on sites like Instagram. And I'm working with colleagues looking currently at how migrants to Adelaide experience creating an online persona, particularly through the pandemic. So broadly speaking, I research and teach on the field of digital media with a particular interest in how people present themselves in these spaces.
I invited you today to talk about sharing #home on Instagram, which is an article that you wrote in 2019. But then we did have an exchange about your new project. So if you can start talking about this new project that you're doing and what's about, then we can start the discussion with the rest.
So the Sense of Home project is we're calling it a comparative autoethnography. And it's a work that I'm doing with a colleague of mine, Dr. Saira Ali, who works with me at the University of Adelaide. And it's part of a wider project called Migration and Settlement, which includes another colleague of ours, Dr. Hasti Abasi. And the Sense of Home project is about starting to look at ourselves as the first point, doing research into how people present themselves online. And we're particularly looking at ourselves as migrants in this space. So both Saira and I, and Hasti as well, are migrants to Australia. And we wanted to look at the way that we engaged with this idea of home and of making home while being essentially stuck in Adelaide beyond what we'd ever intended. So we've all settled here to a degree. Hasti lives in Melbourne now, but Saira and I are settled in Adelaide. We intend to stay here for the foreseeable future, but we also couldn't leave. The Australian border control that came in as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic shut the borders completely. So we couldn't leave, other people couldn't come in. It was a closed context, and that was not just within the country, but within the state. So we were suddenly very much fixed in this place where we were migrants. And so Saira and I realised that although our migrant journeys to Australia they had some areas of overlap, but she's come from Pakistan, I've come from New Zealand. They're quite different cultural contexts. I'm much similar to Australia than Saira is in terms of our home context, of our country of origin. So we had this sense that we had similarities in both coming here to study and then work as academics, but also that we had this connection to our homeland in terms of our countries of origin, which was both similar and different as well, and that we were engaging in presenting ourselves in particular ways through social media to our families and friends internationally, and in some cases interstate as well. What we really started to think about was that it was not just about what we were sharing, but what we weren't. We were very lucky in Adelaide in that there was very little impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 and even into 2021. It's only really been in the last probably 2 months that we've seen any kind of community spread, and that's as a result of Omicron and the deliberate decision on the part of the state government to allow coronavirus into the state when we have already high vaccination rates. So we have lived relatively untouched lives. A lot of the things that we were doing were things that other people were not able to do. And so we were adjusting the way that we were sharing online, in part not to make other people jealous, I guess. There was a sense that we needed to be sensitive to the hardships elsewhere, but also that we were trying not to seem homesick or ungrateful or all of the other things that migrants have to kind of negotiate when balancing the country that they live in with the countries or previous places that they've lived. And so the Sense of Home project was about digging into that and thinking about what it meant for us to present ourselves through these spaces, to present our home spaces, whether that's our physical house, place of residence, or our home in terms of the city and the state, and the impacts of the way that we were living our lives, and the way that visualizing that and visibilizing that for other people might have unintended consequences, potentially in making people either feel sorry for us because we're very isolated, we don't have family connections and those kinds of things in state, but also potentially making us seem unheeding of the disruption internationally, which we were very kind of hyper conscious of and had impacts on us in other ways.
Like you posted online and then you start to re-elaborate in a second time, so you were not conscious when you were posting?
No, so we conceptualized this project in early 2021. At that point, kind of went, hey, so we should start thinking about ourselves. How can we do this? Because within persona studies, there's a real consideration that researcher reflexivity of looking at yourself is really important. If we're going to ask other people to share themselves, then it's, I guess, good practice to think about interrogating yourself as well. And so we wanted to do that, and we wanted to find a way of doing that. And the bounded nature of the impact of 2020 as a year in time, it was quite a significant year in all sorts of ways. Saira moved state in February, started her job at the university. I had, work commitments and other things that were significant that were happening over that time. I got promoted at the beginning of 2020, and so I was taking on new responsibilities as well. And so those kinds of things marked out that year, and then the existence of this kind of larger context of the world as well. So we're absolutely not conscious of what we were doing at the time. It was very much looking back. So it was about what did we post. So we downloaded all of the content from 2 different sites each to analyze. And then we wrote reflective statements as well. So we looked through that data and went, what did we do? Why did we do it? What surprised us? And you'd be surprised looking across a year's worth of photographs how much you don't remember doing. I was surprised that there was as many photos of food on Instagram. I don't remember taking photos of food or posting photos of food, but I did for like a couple of weeks when we were in our short lockdown here. It was about 5 or 6 weeks. But these kinds of things were surprising. And so it was looking back and going, what was I doing? Why was I doing that? And it was about normalizing my life at that time, reassuring people that everything was okay. It was about kind of emphasizing those rituals in our homes that we developed of, being able to eat delicious home cooked meals in the middle of the day, which is not something that I'd be able to do usually if I was on campus teaching. I would have to pick something up quickly or eat a sandwich. And sharing time as well with my daughter and being able to do things at home during the day that I wouldn't ordinarily get to do with her, while also recognizing the disruption to both her schooling and my work as a result of that. So all of these things kind of played out over the course of the year. And for Saira, they were different. She was much more conscientious about not sharing photos of her every day. So she was sharing photos of outside, of animals. And for both of us, what we realized that there's very few people in a lot of our photos beyond ourselves, because people didn't wear masks in our state in 2020. There was an attempt not to be too close to people that you don't know, but certainly not the widespread kind of physical distancing that was enforced in a lot of other places. What we noticed was a lot of the photos that we were taking were empty of people almost by design. And we found, looking back, that was a really kind of interesting component of thinking about doing that deliberately, I guess. Perhaps not consciously, but, it was certainly a decision made somewhere along the line internally not to share that kind of thing.
So you post something, you're not fully conscious about it, but at the end of the day, you make a decision of who is your audience based on how and what you post.
I do think there's something interesting in that sense that sharing online might be kind of unconscious or automatic, but I think that there is a lot more agency in the process than we give ourselves credit for. Perhaps people don't always think of the implications of what they post, but I think that there is agency in our decision to capture an image, to upload it, to click all those buttons, to tag it, to write a caption, to tag people, and all of those kinds of things. Perhaps we're not giving ourselves and each other sufficient credit in thinking that we're doing things without thinking. But I think we're choosing to post these things. It's not being done on our behalf, and I don't think we're as automated in that process as perhaps sometimes it comes across. Now, to connect to your project, what I found really interesting was the selection of objects and images was really interesting. in terms of how many of them were small and portable kind of domestic items that people were photographing, and also that people were taking quite a lot of care in the way that they photographed those objects. So quite often they were photographed in particular contexts. So if it was a mug, for example, it was a mug that was being held, that was being used, that was full of tea or coffee or whatever it was. It wasn't just, having just been washed and on, this is the thing that I'm interested in, click. There was thought gone into the way that that photograph was taken as much as the way that the object itself was important to people. I think it would be also really super interesting to go back to people and say, what was your second choice? And why didn't you choose that thing? What was the thing that you were not willing to share or that was overtaken by the one that you did? So if I'd taken part in the project, for example, I might have shared photos of my garden or of my cat. But the flip side of that then is the pots full of half-dead plants that I didn't keep alive, right? Or the collection of cat toys that my cat never plays with because he doesn't actually like toys, but I keep buying them. So that idea of what was the second choice or what's the flip side? What's the object that has meaning to you in a way that isn't sociable?
You started this project and you also looked at how you were trying to be positive, how your posts and your approach to things actually was bringing up positivity along the way. Why did you look at it with this frame? Why the idea of being positive?
I guess not contributing to further pain or hardship or negativity is something that both Saira and I realised that we were doing through our own posts. As migrants, we were trying not to upset family back home or get them to worry about us. There's a kind of constant negotiation between being truthful in your experiences, settling into a new country and being in a new country, and then being isolated in that country as a result of a global pandemic. People can't do anything about it if they're worrying about you from another place. Certainly this is something that's come out in our wider research where we're talking to other migrants as well, is that not wanting to upset people back home or have them worry about you is part of the process of posting. And there's a couple reasons why that might be that we've brought out of our own experience. And one is simply that there's nothing that they can do about it, but it's also about justifying your own choice if you're a migrant by choice. If you've got people back home saying, come back home, and you say, oh, I'm feeling a bit homesick. They're like, yes, awesome, come back. You made the wrong choice, come back to us. Thankfully, I don't have that, but I certainly, I know that my family would be very happy if I ever made the decision to go back to New Zealand. They'd be delighted to have me back. There's that fear of not wanting to, I guess, add fuel to their desire to have you back, but then also just not wanting to upset or to have people worry about you is a part of it as well.
Do you want to say something about the article of Sharing Home on Instagram, and then we go to the final question?
The Sharing Home on Instagram article looked at a number of different hashtags that were related to home. And what it looked at was the way that people shared images of spaces, of people, of objects, of activities that related to what they understood home as being. And this was well before COVID. As a result, the images were quite an interesting range of different types of things. So there was a lot of snapshots of family spaces being used and people watching television, a few artful photos of sunsets through wine glasses and shots out of aeroplane windows coming into land. So it was that idea of home being a dwelling, a building, but also a place in a broader sense. It might be a country, it might be a town, or it might be people. What we conceptualize as home can be much broader than the building that we sleep in. My sense is that since the coronavirus pandemic has taken over, and I haven't done any systematic analysis of this, but that there has been a shift in the way that people are photographing their homes. We're spending a lot more time in them. The snapshots, I think, are diminishing, at least in the spaces that I'm engaged in. People are spending more time setting up and framing images. The quick snapshots that are a bit messy and a bit less focused are perhaps less visible than they were. I'm also seeing a lot more photos of open spaces, open sky, through trees, from balconies, from the ends of streets, where people are not perhaps able to leave their dwelling, if they're in lockdown, for example, they're imagining much bigger spaces through the photos that they're taking. And this is also interesting in the context of Instagram, because Instagram privileges a shallow depth of field in their photos. So it's very difficult to put expansive landscape photos on Instagram. It doesn't copy over well into that space because of the way that the 1x1, the square frame works, but other elements as well. And then the norms of the space. A shallower depth of field is much more common. And then also the growth of pet photography. I keep talking about pets, but they're really important when we think about homes, because they tie us to places and they tie us to buildings, and they provide warmth and softness to our home spaces. And that allows us to distinguish those spaces from, for example, workplaces or public settings. So in our work days, the fact that we are having pets and children and family members interacting with us across our work days in our home spaces, which are now dual purpose work and home spaces, I think it's a marker of a shift towards the kind of blurring of lines between public and private lives. And the photography that's gone along with the pandemic, I think, is reflecting that. So I think all of these things are really interesting in the way that people are photographing spaces and objects and places. And I think it's across the range, both in terms of the content of the photographs, the framing, and the way that people are engaging.
How were you using your living space at home, and how this has changed during your lockdown experience?
I have a home office. I'm very lucky to have a room to myself in my home as an office. And so I was sharing that for a time with my daughter when she was schooling from home. Having this as a space where I can keep my things out of the public space is much easier. So the way that I've used my home perhaps hasn't changed significantly, because I was incredibly lucky to have this space already. I've had some changes in the way that we've negotiated our relationship to the house in terms of how much time I spend out of it. Travel time, I think, is a real big one. So not having to get up as early, being able to take longer approach to your day, being able to enjoy your home in the morning, heading towards the normal start of the workday, but not having to rush out the door to catch a bus to do school drop-off. All of those things really do change the way that you think about your house and the way that you use it.
What type of value do you personally give to objects, and how this has changed during your lockdown experience?
In terms of objects, I think I've realised over the last 24 months or so that I get more joy from things that are imperfect or that are adapted rather than things that are standardised and uniform. I don't think that that's unique to me. I think that we value interesting things that are different. It gives our eyes something to land on and, makes connections in our brains. The turn to craft and making over the pandemic, I think, is part of this as well, that idea of imperfection and tactility. A colleague and I have written previously on the ways that we domesticate our electronic smartphones and our laptops to make them work and look the way that we want. So we put covers and images and stickers and apps onto our phones and our laptops and so on. And I think that this process of domesticating functional items is about asserting a kind of sense of control over things that we use, objects that we use, but we don't necessarily fully understand how they operate. And so that we make them ours, we add softness to their hard edges. And I think that there's a real joy in that process of domesticating technology, making it work for us.
What does sociable objects mean to you, or what make you think the word sociable objects?
So this is a concept that really intrigues me, and I think it's such a flexible and interesting concept in lots of ways. There are things that we love to share, so objects that we love because it allows us to share things with others. They drive our social connections, so they might be our devices, our transportation. We might be sharing objects with another person, so books or games or meals or treats. There are objects that provide a spark for connection, so it might be plants or artwork or knickknacks in the home. There are things that we might not consider objects in a physical sense as well, that allow the same kind of connections to occur as physical objects. So it might be posts, digital images or ideas or spaces or memories that allow for connections. So to me, the concept of a sociable object is something that facilitates our relationship to ourselves and to other people.